was the race factor here in terms of, I mean, because, conceptually, right, we're looking at these specific, obviously, the Great Depression is the primary factor. But how the
huge rupture.
How the Great Depression was also sort of short-circuited these other political forces is what we're talking about, right? In terms of which allowed the response to be to the Great Depression one thing as opposed to another.
That's exactly right. So, and which is not to say the other wasn't out there. I mean, you had populists like Father Coughlin, you had America Firsters, you had communists, you had all sorts of people who were vying for position in this crisis. But what allowed for this sort of mild social democratic tinge to American politics to solidify, I think, is just such a fascinating question, and one we tend to presume rather than ask. So the number of it's I guess what I'm trying to say is all of those things are there. They were there before, they were there after, but the New Deal had enough power, enough to triumph over those, and that's when I say that it's mitigated, not sort of an on-off switch for these other factors. And now race is the one you raised, and that is by far the most complicated issue, I think, in American politics and in my book. The politics was very, very racialized, obviously, based essentially on racial exclusion and the creation of Jim Crow, and the Democratic Party was very complicit, obviously, in Jim Crow in a variety of ways. Come the 1930s, you see this really interesting balancing act where the New Deal is passed, but in order for it to pass, you need to essentially exclude African American occupations. And we don't really think about this enough, that in order to get the Southern congressional delegation to vote for the New Deal, you essentially have to exclude people who work in agriculture and service work, and because they don't want to empower African American people in the South. So it requires this massive compromise, this essentially an exclusion, the creation of a false homogeneity, in the sense that, okay, well, we're going to leave this huge hot button issue off the table for now. And I think it essentially, that's why you see the major eruption 30 years later with the civil rights movements. But at the same time, the New Deal is also encouraging a certain amount of black participation. Roosevelt has his black cabinet, and Eleanor is out there sort of making links between the White House and African American groups and things like this. And so one commentator at the time said that the Democratic Party is carrying water on both shoulders in terms of the race question, both excluding and including. And it's a balance that could only last a little while until rights really began to come back to the forefront in the post-war era.
So, I mean, so conceptually, as we're looking at this, there are we have a major catastrophe, right? And we certainly.
Which one are you thinking about?
Well, I'm thinking about the Great Depression. And
okay, yeah.
And well, we'll get to the catastrophes of our modern era in a bit. But
that's what I wasn't sure whether you.
But I'm just trying to, because, and your thesis is that the normal, I guess, the pre-existing and the sort of like underlying foundations of American society are such that were it not for the suppression of those three elements at that time, we would not have been able to get the New Deal. Was there something about the suppression of those elements that allowed the idea of like mild social democracy, as you say, to filter through as opposed to other things? Like, I mean, I'm imagining all these things waiting at the gate, and they're all different shapes. One's a square, one's a circle, one's a diamond, and it just so happens that the things that sort of peel away from the gate create a diamond, and so the diamond passes through. But what was that it, or was it that there was a specific impetus that was just pushing and they were lucky, or as opposed to it being, there's plenty of examples of when
Right.
and usually other countries, and usually we're involved on one end of it, where there's a catastrophe and we move in and privatize the hell out of it or whatever it is.
Right, exactly. Well, if you actually look, the Great Depression is not the only economic catastrophe in American history. There's a depression in the 90s. There's one in the 1870s, 1890s, and there's a panic in the 1830s, and we of course know the 1970s in our own time. And in most cases, capital gets the upper hand, right? Business gets the upper hand in those crises. But this time, in the 1930s, working people did. Regular people got a leg up. And the question is, why? And I've never really thought about your metaphor of sort of like the shape is passing through the right hole, but I do think that's sort of what happened. Now, you're raising a kind of a complicated historiographical question, which is, what's the connection between earlier types of reforms and the 1930s? So in the past, we said, the Progressive Era, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, that's a dress rehearsal. Like, we got our engines running, and then we really took off in the 1930s, right? But my argument basically says that stuff was its own thing, and had it not been for the Great Depression and World War II, which really doubled down on the role of the state in American society. Without the Great Depression, I don't think you would have seen this major burst of reform. One way I often go about this is saying, who was vice president under Roosevelt in the first term? Nobody knows. It was a segregationist Southerner, Texas Jack Garner, Cactus Jack Garner. And, had Roosevelt, for instance, not survived the assassination attempt that happened prior to him taking office, that's who we would have had as president. And I can imagine a very different scenario. So you also have very specific individual circumstances playing in this, in addition to these large demographic and political transformations.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos